Hey, it's Renee from the Craft Table. I'm here again for another weekly video in our summer embroidery stitch along. We are up to week 13. This week we have our last embroidery stitch tutorial. Next week, which is our last week, we will discuss finishing up our panel, how to press it in a way that we don't squish our stitches, and then I'll present various options of what you can do with your stitched panel, whether that is turning it into a pillow cushion, framing it, turning it into a tote bag, or maybe even incorporating it into a quilt. So for the last embroidery stitch in this summer embroidery stitch along, we are going to learn how to do the woven wheel stitch. This stitch is another one of those stitches that has a wow factor when it's finished, but it's not complicated to do whatsoever. It is a good stitch for filling in circles or making flowers. To me, it kind of looks like a rose, the center of a rose when it's stitched. So let's get started. This is a good stitch for filling in circles and to make flowers, specifically a flower that looks like a rose. I'm using this snow thread, even though it's not the same color as this circle that I'm going to be stitching. It doesn't really matter because I'm going to be covering it up, so you will not see the color underneath. I wanted to have a little bit of contrast. The first thing you do is stitch out what I call the spokes of the circle. And you want to make sure the number of spokes that you draw out and stitch is an uneven number. And you also want to make sure that they're evenly spaced around the circle. Now, this circle is surrounded by 5 petals, so I'm going to use that as my guide. If I didn't have these petals as a guide, I would draw out my lines ahead of time, and they would go from the center of the circle out, and I would make sure that I had either 5 or 7, depending on the size of the circle. 3 is, unless you're doing something really small, I think is too few of a number. I usually go with 5 unless it's something rather large, and then I would go with 7. And you can stitch from the center out or out towards the center. Since I am using the flower petals as my guide, I am starting from the outside of the circle and stitching towards the center. Also want to point out that this stitch does use up quite a bit of thread, as you will see. Okay, so I have my 5 spokes stitched. And now I'm going to bring my thread up to the top in the center, right next to one of the spokes. It doesn't really matter where you begin. And the rest of the stitching is done on top, and it's really not stitching, it's more weaving. Because what you're going to do is you're going to run your needle over and under each of the spokes, going around the circle and continuing until you fill up the space. So I'm going to start by going over this first stitch and then under the next stitch. And then going over this stitch and under this stitch. and then again over this stitch and then under this stitch. So you'll notice as I'm going over this 5th spoke or long stitch and under this next one, this is where we began, where we went. And so the first time around, I went over this one and now I'm going under it. And that's why it's important to have an uneven number of these long straight stitches. And that's what makes the design, because you're going over and under, and each time around, it's the opposite of that same spoke. So where we went over this one, now we're going under. And as we went under this one the first time, now we're going over, if that makes sense. And you can adjust the tension as you're going around. And if it helps, you can use the back of your needle rather than the point as you're going over and under. Whatever's easier to make sure that you're not piercing the fabric as you go around. And you just keep doing this, following the same over, under process. Until you've finished, until you've covered up the area. Now you can see as I'm doing the weaving that there appears to be more space left on one side than the other. And that could be due to a couple of things, either because I was using the petals as my guide and this was a very organic flower, which meant they probably weren't exactly evenly spaced. That could contribute to this situation. It could be how tight I'm pulling my thread on one side versus the other. But you'll see as I get towards the end, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's something that can be corrected as you get towards the end in a couple of different ways. And sometimes it just sort of corrects itself as I go around. So again, I'm not going to worry about it at the moment, but I just wanted to point it out in case you've noticed it as I've been demonstrating this, or if you've noticed it when you're doing your own stitching. Can you see how it's starting to look almost like a rosebud? It's a very cool effect. Also, as you get towards the edge, sometimes it's hard to see that spoke, that straight stitch that you've stitched, but it's there. You can also take your needle and play around with the shape. So I'm nearing the end of my circle. And again, I just want to point out, it's not too obvious, but the right side is filling up faster than the left side. So when I'm doing my over-under weaving on this side over here that's pretty much complete, as I'm going under, I'm taking my needle I'm still going under the spoke, but instead of going to the side of the previous stitch, I'm kind of going under it. So I'm not In other words, I'm really not making it any wider on this particular side, but I'm still doing my weaving. I think my center is looking pretty good and pretty even. So this might be my last time around. There. Yeah, I think that, you know, I'm gonna go around one more time, I think. So once I'm finished, I'm just gonna take my needle to the back. I'm going to insert it sort of in the underneath here so it doesn't affect the shape of my stitch. And then I can manipulate the shape if I need to. But there, I think that's a really nice stitch, gives it a great effect without a lot of work. You can even use this on its own if you wanted to make a series of roses, because to me that's what it looks like, you know. I've also stitched this on much larger areas where when I was done, the center almost, you can kind of see here, there's just a little bit of a well almost. So I've gone back in and I've done French knots in the center. That gives it a really pretty look. With this being the last week of the stitch along where we actually learned an embroidery stitch, and with us going over finishing techniques next week, I wanted to show you some of the places that I have filled in on my panel in between the different weeks of me demonstrating a embroidery stitch. So I don't think I am completely finished with everything that I want to do, but I did go back and let's see. Okay, let me zoom in a little bit. So on this big flower here, I'm not really thrilled with this. So that's why I only did this one and I haven't done this one yet because I'm not sure whether I like it or not. But so right here where I haven't stitched yet, you can see, you know, it's an orange flower, but along the outside there's like a purplish blue as well. So I did a back stitch in the orange thread around the outside of the flower. And then I went back with the purple thread and did the whipped back stitch. So I did do that on this flower. I went back and added a bunch of back stitches in this design. This is what we did this week. I did the raised chain stitch here, and then the chain stitch all along around this. I think that is something that I did. I went back and did a whole bunch more of the raised chain stitches on most of the stems. Went back and satin stitched with the outlines, with an outline of a back stitch on this, and the same flowers repeated down here. I did one as a demo that week, and then I went back and did that. Let's see, what else did I do? I did small chain stitches inside this heart. Chain stitch here rather than the raised chain stitch. I just did the regular chain stitch, back stitches, and did straight stitches down here. Raised chain stitch, raised chain stitch, regular chain stitch here. I did, let's see. So on this one, I think when we were doing the satin stitch, I demonstrated it here with the purple leaves, and then I went back and I did the raised chain stitch on the stem. I am considering on this big yellow flower here, I'm considering doing the woven wheel around the outside of this. So what if I decide to do that, what I would do is I would do straight stitches, do my spokes evenly spaced around here. So I'm starting on the outside of this. Haven't decided. That's what I'm thinking about doing. I still have a week before we talk about, finalizing everything. And I need to go back and do the raised chain stitch here like I did on my original sample. So I had promised that I would show you everywhere I stitched and what I stitched. Again, the raised chain stitch here with some just straight stitches. And then I did the pistol stitch for the antenna on this little caterpillar. And then the same thing over here with this butterfly, the pistol stitch. Okay. So yeah, so mine's coming along. I hope to have it finished by next week when we talk about finishing techniques. I hope that you've made a lot of progress on your panel as well. You can see by, just looking at my panel, some of my favorite stitches, chain stitch and raised chain stitch. I even went back and I think I had demonstrated the buttonhole blanket stitch on this, and I took it out and I went back and did the chain stitch because I liked that better. I kept the blanket stitch on this one. So as I'm looking at the panel here, you can see this is where I did the woven wheel. This is where I demonstrated it. This circle here is about the same size as this circle, so you could also do it here if you wanted. This is a little bit smaller. You could do it there. On mine, I think I'm going to do some French knots here. I still need to go back and do the stem stitch on this like I did on this one. So if you're not finished by next week, it's not a big deal. But if you do get a chance between now and next week to work on your fabric panel and go back and do some stitching in areas that you were unsure of before, this is a good time to do that because we have now gone over all of the 12 stitches. Happy stitching, and I will see you next week.